Hello there, I'm Ramjee Chandran and I welcome you to episode 39 of the History of Bangalore. And this is part 4 of my series on the Hoysala dynasty. Now, we are at the end of the 11th century, around 1098-ish. And in this episode, I move from the last descriptions of Vinayaditya to his grandson, Ballala, who took the throne from him. Now, there was a son in between, Ereyanga. He was Vinayaditya's son and Ballala's father. And some say he did rule for a very short while, like 5 years. But others say that he died before Vinayaditya did, so never really made it to the throne and ruled as a prince for 33 years. In the previous episodes of this mini-series on the Hoysalas, I have walked you through their somewhat rugged and humble origins as a hill tribe, rough and ready people who are known for their physical strength, to their decisive turn as sophisticated emperors who caused some of the most beautiful art and architecture known to man. But we cannot gloss over the story of the Hoysalas by romanticizing their history with interesting fables because of all the compelling legacy of this kingdom that is visible even today. And suddenly, it all starts to feel like modern history. But before I plunge in, let me take a moment to thank the Prestige Group for their corporate sponsorship, which makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. Now you can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. Right, so let's talk about the Hoysalas. Now, the Hoysalas never let go of their hill tribe origins. And one proof was that they continued to use the title Malaparol Ganda. It was proudly used by all the Hoysala kings. It even appeared as a standalone word on some of their coinage. Now, that word comes from Malapa, which is a contraction of two words, hill, Malay, and patriarch, Appa. So, the patriarch of the hills or the chief of the hills. But the Hoysalas were not yet the undisputed rulers of all the hill tribes in the region. So one of the first things that they did was have to bring the other hill tribes under their rule. Now the other hill tribes were known in legend as the Danayakas or hill tribe chieftains, and they served the peripheral interests of the Ganga dynasty at the Ganga's pleasure for ages. But when the Gangas fell to the Choras, 9 brothers or the Nava Danayaka took the opportunity in this void to assert their own rule in southern and western Mysore, especially in the Malenadu region. Now, the seat of their power or stronghold was Bettadakotte on Gopal Swami Hill, which is in what we know today as Bandipur and the Mudumalai forest reserves. Now, among them, Bhima Danayaka and 3 brothers led by Perumal Danayaka broke away after a quarrel with the other 5. Bhima took control of Nagarapura, which is the modern Nanjangud, and Ratnapuri, and set up his own government. But the feud was far from over. Now, after a time, 4 brothers marched on Bettadakotte, and their siege of that place lasted for 3 years, and it ended with one of the Danayakas, Mancha Danayaka, who was defending the fort, who leapt from the hill on horseback when the citadel had been all but lost, and he died in his attempt. Now victorious, the 4 brothers installed a family member as governor of Bettadakotte and embarked on rather ambitious conquests. They reportedly reached Goa all the way up north, Davasi Betta in southern Coorg, Bisley Ghat on the west, and the Satyamangala Pass near the Nilgiris on the east. And that was the kingdom that these hill tribes actually built. But for all their initiative, they were disunited and fragmented, and what they had set up was ripe for the plucking. And the waiting Hoysalas were ready to do this plucking. Vinayaditya, perhaps with his son Ereyanga, who has been given much of the credit for the campaign, defeated all the Danayakas and added their entire valuable terrain to the yet nascent kingdom of the Hoysalas, which gave that kingdom its first shape. One of the first notable events in the time of Ereyanga, whether or not he was briefly the king, was that they shifted their capital from Sosavur, which is a small little town in Malenadu, to Belur, which was right at the junction of very important trade routes. At this stage, as I said, they were still nascent, an upcoming force, and they were still feudatories of the Chalukyas. And not only that, they were still on the fringe of the Chalukyas' ambit of interest. And the reason why I say on the fringe is because even if the Hoysalas were a Chalukya feudatory, Bene Aditya doesn't seem to have been important enough to have participated in major battles between his overlords, the Kalyani Chalukyas and the Choras. For example, the fierce Battle of Koppam in 1052 AD. Now, the antagonist in that battle was Somashekara of the Kalyani Chalukyas, who faced off against Rajadiraja of the Choras. The backdrop to the Battle of Koppam had been fierce and aggressive campaigns by Somashekara, who tried to re-establish Chalukya dominance in the entire southern Deccan. So between 1045 and 1050 AD, the Choras and the Chalukyas were at war, a war that was pockmarked by several battles. They occupied and reoccupied the Vingi Chalukya kingdom, and then they fought battles on the Kalyani home turf, and eventually Somashekara was able to regain control of his own kingdom simply because the Choras upped and left the area and went back to Talakadu. Now, not only had the Choras left the western Chalukya territory, but they had pretty much taken their hands off the wheel even after they had subdued the Vingis, the eastern Chalukyas. Now, please listen to an earlier episode where I detailed the Chora campaign and their lack of desire to turn military gains into political gains, leaving the areas not in their commercial interests ungoverned or with some form of a locally run government. But Somashekara was unwilling to let things pass, and he sent forces to make an attack on Kanchi. He was also able to assert overlordship over the Vengi Chalukyas and replace the Choras as their overlords with himself. Now, while the Choras may have shown a complete disinclination to administer the Chalukya territories, whether Kalyani or Vengi, the Chalukyas still posed a threat to the areas of their interest, like the Gangavadi, evidently being the important trade routes. So in 1052, the current Chora king Rajadiraja, accompanied by his younger brother and Crown Prince Rajendra II, waged a battle against Somashekara at Koppam. By all accounts, the Battle of Koppam was bloody and indecisive, and at the end of it, both sides claimed victory. Somashekara was not at the Battle of Koppam. Jaisimha was, but the Chora king Rajadiraja and the Crown Prince Rajendra commanded the Chora army in person. Now Rajendra, the Crown Prince, took the front line on his elephant, and Rajadiraja, the king, and his troops brought up the rear. Things didn't go as planned. An inscription at Thiruvallam says that when Rajendra's elephant was charged by the Chalukya elephant, it panicked and retreated towards the second line. Rajadiraja managed to stop this elephant, but by then, complete and total chaos had set in. Now, the Chora second line joined the vanguard. But the Chalukya's ace archers had turned their attention to Rajadiraja's elephant and unleashed their arrows upon this hapless animal. But in the course of this attack, not only did the arrows hit the elephant, but also Rajadiraja himself. He was killed on the battlefield right there on his elephant, and along with him, several of the Chora key men. There are several accounts that describe how Rajendra II conducted an impromptu coronation ceremony for himself right there on the battlefields of Koppam, and he then became the new king of the Choras. The battle continued. Rajendra rallied the troops. He called in reinforcements and launched an aggressive counterattack, blunted the Chalukya momentum, thwarted their advance, and caused them to retreat, to move back to safer space. And that ended the Battle of Koppam. Now, if you read the Chora records, they say that Rajendra seized massive booty and even captured two of the queens of the Chalukyas. The Chalukya version, of course, tells a completely different story. They claimed victory, boasting that they had captured the Chora capital, Kanchi. Somashekara, the Chalukya king, as I said, wasn't at the battle himself, but his sons, including Jaisimha, were, and some Chalukya records admit that Jaisimha had fled, and other inscriptions claim that he died. But what we do know is among the many casualties was the Nolamba chief, Nanni Nolamba, who had joined the war. Now, what exactly happened at the end of the Battle of Koppam remains unclear. Inscriptions and court poets from both sides spin wildly different and completely absurd tales. There is much more history about the Battle of Koppam that has been told, but we need to cycle back to the matter at hand. All this and no Hoysalas? Now, they were not included as part of the Chalukya forces, and as I said a few minutes earlier, they appeared to be on the periphery of Chalukya's politics and mindshare as small fringe feudatories. So maybe the Hoysalas were not a natural part of every Kalyani Chalukya war as the Gangas had been to the Vatapi Chalukyas. There's another way of looking at this, which I will admit is as much conjecture as anything else, and that is to look ahead in time and consider the close relationship that had developed between the Hoysalas and the Choras during and after the time of Vishnuvardhana. And it will be a matter of great interest to see how this relationship plays out. After the break, I take a closer look at the events that led to the reign of Ballala I and a little bit more about this rather confusing relationship that the Hoysalas had with the Chalukyas and where they went with it. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Hello, I'm back. The tales of the Battle of Koppam are many in number and have been told and dissected variously. But since our interest narrows down to the history of Bangalore, I will focus our attention on the goings-on in the Gangavadi and the Nolambavadi, the two principalities in which the present Bangalore and outlying regions like Tumakuru lie. In the aftermath of the indecisive Battle of Koppam, there was a lot of confusion. Both the Choras and the Chalukyas began appointing governors to the Gangavadi. And one of these governors, or the Mahamandalas appointed by the Chalukyas, was the Hoysala Vinayaditya. A Mahamandala is like a viceroy who had significant regional autonomy but was still a subordinate ruler expected to act in allegiance to the empire, to the overlords. From records, it would seem that a few generations of Hoysala rulers appear to swear allegiance to the Chalukyas. At least, that's what one can get from the inscriptions. But then again, inscriptions don't dwell much on what happens behind the scenes. Vinayaditya had 3 grandsons, all of whom were sons of Ereyanga, who had these sons by one of the 2 Chola princesses that he married. Now, these sons were called Ballala, Vishnuvardhana, and Udayaditya. Their mother was Echila Devi, who has a mention on the record, but very little else is known about her. All we know is that she was a Chora princess. But the most significant story attached to these brothers is how they successfully repelled an attack by a Paramara king called Jagadeva. And riding on this tale is the beginning of that possible disenchantment that had set in between the Hoysalas and their overlords, the Chalukyas, who were led by their king Vikramaditya VI. Now, around 1090 AD, Vinayaditya was already an old man. He had ruled for many years. So, it must have come to him as something of a rude shock to find that his kingdom was now the target of an attack by another Chalukya feudatory, the Paramaras of Malwa. Now, the Paramara king Jagadeva had been on an acquisition spree, and all this was done with the blessings of Vikramaditya VI, who it is said was infatuated by Jagadeva and gave him total leeway to expand his kingdom without interference from the Chalukya overlord. Now the question is, why did this leeway extend to allowing one feudatory, the Paramaras, to set their sights on another feudatory, the Hoysalas? And the answer is twofold. One is that there was a lull in the threats to the Chalukyas. The Vengi East had fallen quiet, There was no immediate or foreseeable use for the Hoysalas to defend the southern dominion of the Chalukyas, ergo they were no longer important. But there was another and larger reason, and this was Vikramaditya coming to the realization that the loyalty of the Hoysalas was not without a generous amount of self-interest. And Vikramaditya, quite justifiably, viewed the Hoysalas with a great deal of suspicion. Now, the historian Dhirendra Ganguly is more categorical on the subject. In his chapter on the Jainad stone inscription of the Parmara Jagadeva, he writes that in the latter part of the 11th century, which is where we are presently, there was an attempt by the Hoysalas to declare independence from the Chalukyas. No great surprise this. But Vikramaditya was very upset by this, and he is said to have asked Jagadeva to attack the Hoysala capital, and furthermore lent him a good component of the Karnataka Bala or Karnataka army. Now, by whatever motivation and with whatever forces at his disposal, in 1093, Jagadeva laid siege to the Hoysala capital Dorasamudra, or Halebeedu as we know it today. But Jagadeva had underestimated the Hoysalas. The brothers Ballala, Vishnuvardhana and Uday led the Hoysala forces against Jagadeva. They were Ereyanga's sons. They rose to the challenge. Now, despite sustaining heavy losses in the beginning of the battle, they were able to find their fighting feet and drove out Jagadeva. The inscriptions are generous with the accounts of the role that the three brothers played in the successful defense of Dorasamudra. And there's a rather poignant moment in the battle when a determined Ballala sat on his horse and charged the elephant upon which Jagadeva sat. The elephant recoiled from the sheer ferocity of Ballala's attack when Ballala delivered a crippling blow. And even as the elephant fell, so impressed was Jagadeva by this adversary that he exclaimed, "Well done, horseman!" And to this the prince replied, "I am no ordinary horseman. I am Veera Ballala." The order in which the names of the brothers are always mentioned on records is Ballala first, Vishnuvardhana next, and Udayaditya third. This leaves little doubt that this was the order of their age and therefore succession. Almost all historical accounts, all drawn from various inscriptions of course, conclude that Ballala took over the reins of his kingdom from his grandfather Vinayaditya. And the reason is that his father Ereyanga had died while Vinayaditya was still king. Yet, some scholars like Duncan Derrett say that after Vinayaditya had died in 1097, Ereyanga did take over as king, although very briefly, and ruled till 1102 AD, about 5 years. But his is almost a lone voice among scholars who refer to a number of inscriptions that say that Ballala took the kingdom from Vinayaditya. One thing is clear though, Vinayaditya was very old, probably in his 80s when he died, and even if Ereyanga had become the king briefly, he would have been in his 60s, in those days considered very old by itself. And whether or not he did become king, or whether he was only de facto king, has fallen to irrelevance in the telling of Hoysala history. But on the subject, Derrett did have this telling remark that shines a light on what I have described as the start of trouble between the Hoysalas and the Kalyani Chalukyas, a kind of trouble in paradise, the end of the honeymoon if you like. Speaking of Ereyanga being too old to participate in the daily affairs of administration and expansion, he said, "We can imagine that his vast experience guided his sons as they crafted a bold new policy, one that left no room for loyalty to the Chalukyas." And as Ballala became king in the first light of the 12th century in 1102 AD, this simmering antagonism between them would shape all the events of their history going forward. Now, when Ballala I took over as king, the first of the inscriptions attributed to him mentions the areas in which the Hoysala dominion were no different from any previous mentions. And from available records, it doesn't seem that there was much that he did to expand the kingdom, at least initially. Indeed, for almost a decade into his reign, there was a lull in Belur, and the Hoysalas took this time to repair and recover from the damage that had been caused by the Paramara attack. It was time well spent. The Hoysalas were at this time at a very interesting junction of their lives. The founding fathers, Vinayaditya and Ereyanga, had died, and they had done well to establish solid foundations for their empire and for the children of Ereyanga. And now there was a new king, Ballala I, and the question is, what should Ballala do? Work towards declaring the Hoysalas an independent or sovereign state, or just continue as feudatories of the Chalukyas? And this goes to the question of what was the role of a king. Was it not his responsibility to bring prosperity and opportunity to his people and spot and seize every opportunity to do this? And should he do this by whatever means that were considered socially, morally, and politically acceptable in the day? In short, was it the king's responsibility to wage war? This was a philosophical question that Duncan dealt with at some length in his book. The situation in which Ballala found himself is not unique. Many dynasties before his, like the Kadambas, the Rattas, or the Rashtrakutas, the Sindhas, the Pandyas, and the northern Choras, had all dealt with very similar existential crises. Some, like the Pandyas of Uchangi, struggled because they had limited resources. Now, these Pandyas were of similar lineage to the Tamil Pandya Empire, but had long settled in the Davanagere area. Now, the other feudatories may have lacked ambition, or they had leaned too heavily on their neighbors for support, and therefore lacked the mojo to do it themselves. But where others faltered, the Hoysala brothers persisted and triumphed even. And in this and the next episode, we will find out how. Now, let's get back briefly to extend the philosophical arguments that I had summarized earlier. If we accept that it is the responsibility of a king to expand his empire, should there be a limit to his ambition and effort? And by what measure and whose rules? For example, should a ruler of a small territory under an imperial overlord seize the chance to break free and expand? Or only take what neighboring rulers have abandoned? And if they expanded, should they aim for something bigger, maybe even ruling the entire peninsula, even if that meant the risk of overreach? Some dynasties like the Sindhas, whom Deret called temperamentally nothing more than feudatories, just like to remain feudatories. They were content. But others like the Chalukyas rose from being feudatories to create empires. So here were the brothers Hoysala, after 7 years of peace and rebuilding, had decided to prepare for campaigns to reshape and expand the Hoysala kingdom. Their aim was clear: transform the Hoysalas from being just a little district under the Chalukyas to a kingdom that could stand as an independent power. And right through the history of the Deccan, we have repeatedly seen how former feudatories have unseated their overlords, the Kadambas, the Vatapi Chalukyas, the Rashtrakutas, and the Kalyani Chalukyas, who all did exactly this. And this, despite the obviously uncomfortable situation they put themselves in, where they become the overlords of other kingdoms who sat recently next to them as complete equals. Well, uncomfortable or not, Ballala and his younger brother Vishnuvardhana took it upon themselves to fulfill their ambitions, and they waited for that opportunity when they could strike the first blow towards making their kingdom grow and becoming a sovereign kingdom to begin with. And that opportunity arose without much delay, when an internal conflict had broken out among the feudatories in the southwest part of the Chalukya kingdom, not too far away from the seat of the Hoysala kingdom. And that is when the Hoysalas made their move. So what happened next with the Hoysalas? Was their strategy successful, or was it a miscalculation and a setback for the Hoysalas? Find out all about that and much more in the very next episode, where more excitement and more drama is coming up. Stay glued. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.